Well, I think political factors should be incorporated because they are fundamental to everything we do in societies and as societies act together in terms of determining economic activities, in terms of determining carbon emissions, but of course also emission cuts and transition towards green economy. Politics is fundamental. And also thinking more at the vulnerability side in terms of supporting weaker communities in society, distribution of goods and public services is fundamental to reducing vulnerability to climate change hazards.
Political factors, sometimes we think they're too complex. But what we're trying to do here is distill the key dimensions to help us understand why we take actions, when we don't, what some of the barriers may be, and what we need to enable.
Because whether countries have the freedoms and rights that come with democracy or not are hugely important for the adoption and implementation of climate mitigation.
Political factors are the way that we negotiate complicated decisions. Climate futures are fundamentally about complicated decisions. If we don't include political factors, and political factors I think means not just politics, but also things like conflict and international relations, so cooperation, lots of different things, then we're missing a big piece of the puzzle. So we need to include political factors to understand the future that we're moving into and creating.
Mostly to characterize future societies more or better than we can do based on the indicators that we have used so far, like economic activity or population.
Climate policy is a very political issue, and I think it's essential that we incorporate political dynamics and insights that we have from political science into the future trajectories of climate policies.
International climate policy, especially in the negotiations, we have kind of moved from the questions of where do we go, so at 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees, that's kind of now stabilized, so we know where to go. And now actually the big question on the table is how do we get there? So, and of course, political factors are so important for implementation, and that's, I think, why it is a crucial factor now to research.
Political factors are crucial in our understanding how things can be done now. By things, I mean actions to prevent or adapt to climate change. And we understand a lot from the engineering perspective, from the economic perspective, but we're still missing variation between countries and over time that makes it more or less likely from a political perspective that actions will be done.
Actually, we can use our models and the projections for a plausibility check for the different scenarios and then see how well our projections later compare to assumptions that were made actually in the scenarios and in the narratives built for the scenarios.
We need political developments in climate and sustainability scenarios in order to mirror real-world trajectories towards mitigation and adaptation in climate change, because political institutions or violent conflicts shape policy designs and policy outcomes, and they can also be shocks. For instance, a war like the Russian war against Ukraine for development processes.
Well, political factors are actually incorporated to some extent in the narratives that are used to motivate scenarios, but they don't translate fully to the quantified side of the scenarios that are usually the drivers that then enter larger modeling exercises. And so bridging that gap and adding some relevant drivers that I actually mentioned in some of the publications introducing these drivers is, I think, a worthwhile exercise to fill this gap.
Important one is first especially the focus on shocks that especially the social scientists have. So we, with our SSP scenarios, have these long-term unified theory views, but they really say you should look at shocks, and that's something that we also learn from other communities, but that's something we can improve, and that's what we take away from this workshop. And the second one is that if you would change these SSPs, there's actually different levers or different levels even you could do it on. So either change the narratives or change our models and include social factors. And that's also what we already kind of knew, but now it's really made explicit and linked to the SSP framework. So that was very useful.
To not be afraid of this complexity. You know, we can add in a lot when it comes to thinking about politics. It's driven by history, it's driven by personalities, but there are some generalizable features, and by pulling those out of some of these more complicated webs, I think we're going to be able to show just beyond, you know, economies, beyond education, really being able to capture more of the drivers that really underpin our action as well as our lack of action.
That there is a lot more research on these political indicators now than there was 10, 15 years ago, and that we need to include this into our scenarios for future development.
As always, it's complicated, and there are many issues to be resolved in order to incorporate political factors into climate scenarios, but I think there is generally willingness to do so.
The main takeaway of the workshop is that these are great people to collaborate with, and these are people who are all struggling with similar issues of the complexity of taking things in the political space, which is typically governed by like political science, disciplinary work, which is not focused on the long-term future, and applying it to long-term models where you have to abstract, so you can't have the level of granularity that you would like because the future is fundamentally unknowable on a certain level. So there's an inherent complication there, and everyone here is struggling with how to deal with that. And so great colleagues dealing with complicated questions of real world importance, and that's what motivates me.
My main takeaway of this workshop is that the time is ripe for integrating political developments such as institutions, such as violent conflicts in climate and sustainability scenarios.